Chapter 18. Noguchi was dozing, a light, restless sleep that seemed to be taking her in and out of unpleasant dreams, when the aging wave scanner started spitting out static and words. Startled out of her doze, Noguchi rolled over to switch it off, wondering why she'd bothered to put the damn thing on in the first place. She touched the controls, then paused, her attention caught by the sound of the speaker's voice. A woman, and she sounded scared. Bundessurvey, we are... Liza's malfunctioning. It was clearer than Noguchi was used to, the words sharper. She hit the tuner rather than the power switch, and upped the volume a notch, then lay back down on her bunk, listening. With the channel re-established, the connection cleared up a little. Pete, this is Bundessurvey. Under attack. Send help. The station ucked up. People screaming. They're invisible. Can't see them and... Noguchi sat up, staring at the scanner. Killing everyone. Invisible. Attack. Hunters. Even through her shocked disbelief, it only took a second for everything to fall into place. The truth was so simple. Wouldn't want me along on a hunt where the grand finale involves killing humans, would you? Can hear me. I'm going to try to see. Can get to... Ships, evacuate. She barely heard it. The thoughts too sudden and overwhelming, blocking out everything else. The warrior with the wrist banner. Topknot's decision for her to fight a novice on the morning of the hunt. The consistent and all-consuming hatred they'd held for her from the beginning. What hunter befriends their prey? Sharpening their skills on bugs, ranting on and on about the hunter's code and the blooding ritual, and maybe some of that was true. But the big hunt, the one that brought leaders and their veteran comrades in from throughout the universe. Humans. They went down there to slaughter people. For a moment, Noguchi couldn't move, her body stiff with a desperate need to do something. Every muscle locked because she didn't know what that thing was. The transports were all gone. There was no way for her to get to the surface. But she couldn't do nothing, listening to some terrified woman screaming for help while she sat and waited for the hunters to return. Topknot, her leader. She'd respected him, and the pain of that thought turned to an anger deeper than mere emotion. Her very soul had been betrayed. She'd suffered a year of hell adhering to a code created by hypocrites, by human killers. Noguchi stood up and walked to the shelf in the corner of the little room before she knew what she was going to do, pulling down things that had been given to her by the hunters. There was the blade with the shortened handle, the knee and shoulder pads that had been a child Yautja's, a dull Eros knife that she'd spent hours sharpening and polishing, honing to a sparkling sharpness. Throwaways from the clan that she'd been proud to own. She didn't have a plan as she started to dress, slipping into her armour, feeling stronger with each layer of splash suit and weaponry, the aches and pains of her body falling away. By the time she was finished, enough of an idea had formed that she was ready to act. Noguchi was going to make her break with the hunters in a way that they would never forget, and she was going to make peace with herself while she was doing it. When it was over, she would be truly free. At last, Briggs and the others were gone, and there was only Keane, watching them, holding Ellis's numb shoulder with a grip like a steel vice. Lara's too, her lovely face lined with pain. Ellis felt dizzy and sick and ashamed. Jess had been badly hurt, and now Briggs didn't believe that there was no ship's log. Through all of it, the only thing that seemed clear, figuratively and literally, was Max. Max stood, giant and invulnerable, watching it all, its hydraulic body almost glowing with energy at rest. Max had been the answer, and Ellis had ignored it. I was afraid of pain, of dying, and I failed to act. If we were together, none of this would have happened. We could have stopped this before anyone was hurt. He'd been weak. He'd already forgotten what Max had taught him. On the floor, Jess moaned. Ellis looked away from Max, feeling a physical ache in his stomach at the sight of his friend. Jess was on his back, his swollen eyes closed. "Jess, are you Can you hear me?" Lara asked, and let out a small cry as Keen gave her a rough shake. Jess cracked his eyes open, rolling slowly onto his side, breathing shallowly. "Yeah," he winced. "Yeah, I hear you." "Stay on the floor," Keen ordered, his Nordic face still flushed from beating Jess, from exertion or pleasure, or both. "Get up, and I'll kill you." Ellis looked at Max again, feeling as though his heart would break. They'd been getting closer since their joining, their thoughts running through his mind now, and he'd been a fool. Max still had multiple 11.52, 100 M309 rounds each. Cartridges for the pulse rifle. At least 20 heat grenades left, and most of its secondary M210 tank was still full of naphthalene. Worst of all, Ellis knew that feeling sorry for what he hadn't done didn't matter at all, and it didn't help that they were still going to be killed by Briggs for information they didn't even have. "Ellis, what's wrong?" Lara said sharply, a thread of terror in her voice. Ellis turned his head, confused, saw that both Keen and Lara were looking at him. And then Lara was moving, bending her knees and slipping out from beneath Keen's hand, coming up from her crouch with her arms straight, her hand flat. And Ellis felt Keen's fingers clench and relax on his shoulder as Lara chopped the side of her hand into his throat, a sound like some crisp vegetable being snapped, erupting from the blonde's quivering lips. He grabbed at his neck with both hands, his eyes wide, his face purpling in seconds. Lara was in a fighting stance, her hands up, ready to hit again. But Keen was no longer a threat. He crumpled to the floor, still clutching at his throat, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. A few seconds later, he wasn't moving at all. Ellis crouched next to him, putting a shaky hand over Keen's mouth. He wasn't breathing. "You killed him," Ellis said, wonderingly. Lara was already moving toward Jess, rubbing at her shoulder. "I used to be a Marine," she said. "People seem to keep forgetting that." Together, they knelt next to Jess, Lara helping to sit up. Jess groaned again, but managed to stay upright, holding his head in his hands. He squinted at Lara from his red eyes, the welts on his face already darkening to black. "Jesus, remind me not to fuck with you," he said softly. Lara smiled a little. "Yeah, well, I was tired of waiting for you to make your move." The floor of the shuttle trembled, the platform beneath seeming to tilt a little more. The distant alarm continued to blare. Jess finally raised his head and sat up straight, gritting his teeth against the pain. "We gotta get out of here," he said. "Can we take off?" Lara shook her head. "We wouldn't make it more than a few clicks. We need to refuel. And we don't have VTOL. I have to program some kind of flight plan." Jess looked at Ellis, studying his face. "Kid, you with us?" Ellis nodded, not sure why Jess was asking, knowing only that he had to make up for his failure. "Yeah, of course." With help from both of them, Jess crawled to his feet, swaying for a moment. 0.37, before he found his balance. Lara crouched next to Keen and rifled through his suit, pulling out the semi-automatic that had been taken earlier. "Get on the program," Jess said. "Ellis, I'm going to need your help, come on." Ellis nodded, wondering why so much of this felt like a dream, why the numbers in his mind wouldn't stay, wouldn't take the place of the turbulent and unpleasant emotions that continued to plague him. He felt confused and unsure of himself. But as he followed Jess out into the strange night, he swore that he wouldn't give in to his feelings, and that whatever it took, he wouldn't screw up again. Jonathan Calistori, aka John C., made it to control without going outside again, using one of the maintenance stairwells and coming in from the corridor that led to the central lift. The door had been blocked, but he was let in once he'd screamed his name a few times, babbling his story out to the scared young archaeologist who opened the door. He'd had to jump over Cabot's body, dragging Di along with him, and before they made it to the tunnel, she had been grabbed away. hot blood from her cut throat splashing against the backs of his legs as he crawled into the dark. Control was packed, people crying and semi-hysterical and pale with shock. Windy and then 2 others had been murdered just outside. The sight of their bloody bodies feeding their collective terror. Cabot was dead. Vincent wasn't there. And there were a few more screaming, pounding knocks at the inner door, frightened researchers tumbling in with stories of alien howls and invisible beings, of friends and co-workers slain. In all, it took a few moments for any kind of order to be established. One of the pilots, Lee Goldman, finally called for a head count. There were 13 Bunda people missing, 8 confirmed dead, and no one had any idea what had attacked them. Goldman and the other Bunda pilot, Les Drucker, called for an immediate evac. No one disagreed, except for Chris Aquino, who didn't want to leave without his missing lover, and a woman named Irwin, the Sunjumper pilot, who was waiting for her boss to show up. John C. thought they were nuts, but then he wasn't all that sure of his own sanity anymore. The feeling of Di's blood cooling against his calves was a nightmare like no other, turning part of his mind into a vague and shadowy place that he did his best to stay out of. Goldman took charge, sending 2 of the more together biotechs to the supply room for what weapons Bunda had, and getting Evans to set up the AD signal on a pulse to the next outpost. Once they were armed, they'd move out to the transports en masse and go. There was no real discussion about waiting for the missing few to show. The subject unanimously ignored. Maybe they'd hear the ships warming up and make it out to the LZ in time to board. If they didn't, they were probably dead already. Together, they waited for Karen and Rich to get back with weapons, silent and afraid as they listened to the open intercom, listened for screams. After Evans had sent out their auto-distress, he tried to get some of the others to join him in a prayer, but he didn't have many takers. John C., a lapsed Catholic, thought that if Evans had seen what he had, he'd realised that God had nothing to do with what had happened on Bunda. The devil was more like it, the planet his now. If God had any interest at all in taking care of matters, there was going to be a war. And all John C. wanted was to get the hell out of the way.